Thanks so much. Hi everybody, I'm Michele from Michigan's Children, and I'm really quite honored to be here as part of this panel and as part of this conversation. And I'm not certain that I'm going to cover all the things that Anne was just saying I was going to cover, but I am going to try to help kind of frame the rest of the conversation a little bit more broadly. And as was discussed, I'm from Michigan's Children, which is a policy advocacy organization. So I have the good fortune to work every day on trying to figure out how we can make public policy work better for kids and families in the state. And to make that happen, we believe that public policy needs to be made with the facts, right? Based on the facts, based on information, based on research and evidence. And so forums like these and conversations that include policymakers and experts around this table, around those tables, are hugely important. There's some other information about Michigan's Children back there if anybody wants to know more, but I'm really glad to be here on behalf of the organization. I like to show this slide because public policy, especially as it relates to kids and families, really the purpose of public sector investment, one of the main purposes of public sector investment is to level the playing field. So we talk a lot about equality, we talk a lot about equity, and I just like to start the conversation about what we're talking about is making sure that all those kids can see the game. And how are we actually pulling through our policy investment priorities and our program work to be able to do that the best we can. And some of the kids that have the least opportunity to see the game right now are kids that are involved in the child welfare system. So we have a lot of work to do in that regard, and we're going to talk more about it today. So this slide, when I was thinking about it, I thought, well, clearly everyone in the room is going to understand why we're having this conversation today. But just as a framework around how we're sort of moving through, it's a huge problem that there's a real predictability of poor outcomes for kids that have been involved in the child welfare foster care system. That's a huge dilemma, right? That we can actually predict these very negative outcomes. They're more likely to have health problems, more likely to have mental health issues, more likely to have substance abuse issues. I mean, I think some of the rest of this conversation, we could go more deeply into that, but the baseline is there's predictable negative outcomes for kids that pull through the systems despite kind of our best efforts, right? I mean, despite efforts, lots of good efforts being made. So it's just about kind of redoubling. There's also a huge overrepresentation of children of color in our systems, and that's due to all sorts of things. Has to do with poverty, has to do with race and class bias, has to do with all sorts of things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as time goes on too. But I think the most important reason to be having this conversation, especially about kids who are in foster care, is that we have, as a state, a unique responsibility for this group of kids. We have made decisions that have altered where they live, who's caring for them, how they're going to school, all sorts of things. And we have taken on that responsibility as a state. And so that it just makes it incredibly important that we are aligning our public investment and policy in the best way that we can for this group of kids. I think that it behooves us to think a little bit about the under-resourced system that we find ourselves in with child welfare and foster care. There are a lot of experts in this room that work in the system, that work in financing of the system. So if we want to talk more deeply about that, I'm sure we can later. frankly, we have a huge over-reliance on federal money and very limited state investment beyond what's actually required to get that federal money in child welfare specifically. And it's across the board for lots of services in Michigan. We went through a period where we basically removed a lot of state investment in lots of programs serving kids and families. And this over-reliance on the federal government's decisions is fine as long as they keep making good decisions. It's not enough. It doesn't provide flexibility that some other states enjoy with their foster care systems and some of their prevention systems, when those states have actually pulled in a little bit more flexible resource to serve these kids and families. So there's been a lot of really innovative and positive practice in child welfare and foster care in the state. Part of the dilemma, because it's an under-resourced system, is that a lot of that really great work ends up in a pilot, ends up not being available across the state, ends up not being a statewide, consistently funded and supported innovation, which is obviously difficult on kids and families. It's difficult on service providers. The privatization of our child welfare system, I would not even dream of being an expert in any way in the privatization of our child welfare system. Michigan is not unique in a combination of privatization, public sector, utilization of private agencies. I just saw Janet coming in right now, so we got lots of expertise on this issue. It's not a positive or negative, but it does contribute to the sort of inequity of service, and service being different for kids and families depending on where you live in the state. So depending on sort of the capacity of the service provision where you are, does shift your ability to get services. And then where Michigan's Children pulls into this discussion a lot too is the fact that a lot of the support services that are both required, that we have determined to be required for kids that come into the child welfare system, and those that might be helpful to kids that come in, families coming into the system, are also under-resourced. So two that I would just, I mean, you can't stabilize kids and families by sort of investing in the child welfare system alone. There's other systems that also need to be stabilized and shored up. Two examples I would give, and I'm pretty sure that Sasha's going to talk a little bit more about at least one of these, is that childcare. So we have automatic referral for kids in care, for childcare, but we're referring them to what is a desperately inadequate childcare system in the state. So there's still lots of dilemmas about accessing quality care, about differences depending on where you live, about how that all works out. Another one is early on, so early identification and services related to developmental delays. So it's like our infant and toddler special ed. We have automatic referrals to that program as well through child welfare. But what happens is that program is so different because it's so under-resourced. It's so different depending on where you are in the state, that for some kids coming into the system, and families, it's a huge benefit. For others, not so much, because their program isn't robust. So to really think both about how the child welfare system itself is under-resourced and how the systems around it are also under-resourced is an important part of our conversation today. This is just, I don't even need to show you this. This was just an illustration of the fact that we don't put any general fund. This is just one space. It's family preservation. And the green line is federal money, and that's our state money, is nothing on the bottom. So for years, it's just an illustration of the limited state level flexible funding investments that we make in some of these programs that we really need to have bigger investments in. So Another point that's important framing this conversation is that probably all public policy is impacted by crisis, and all public policy decisions to some extent are sort of driven by, holy crap, that happened last week on the freeway or whatever, right? In child welfare, it's even more so. This idea of something happens, some unique event happens, a child is significantly harmed, there's just an awful, tragic thing that goes on, and no one is taking away from that awful, tragic thing. But part of the problem with policy making around crisis and tragedy is that then your policy making gets driven by truly the worst case scenario of a system. And sometimes a very unique thing that it gets made based on sort of this worst case scenario. And child welfare really leads us to needing to find a criminal, needing to find someone to blame for this happening. And so oftentimes that ends up being a birth parent or foster parent, the system itself. We have to find sort of the criminal in the room, as versus really thinking about how are we literally supporting these systems for families before they come in, while they're in, as they leave. So it becomes difficult for public policy making to be made in this regard. And we actually, we have examples of that right now. We had examples through time, right? So our system was sued. And so then that creates a criminal, right? The department wasn't doing what it needed to be doing to keep kids safe, to da-da-da-da, without really digging into the fact that it was an under-resourced system to begin with. And the systems that could have supported families around it were under-resourced. We've obviously, and again, there's people here that could talk about the settlement, but that was an issue, that's an issue. And then we have the example of most recently, so that was a while ago, most recently with the Nassar case, with the MSU case, we have this horrific, really inexplicable thing that does have criminals and does have, but then that leads to sort of this swath of policy conversations, about who needs to be reporting abuse and neglect. How do we punish them if they're not reporting abuse? It leads us to these sort of larger conversations that have larger implications, this idea of policy made in crisis. I'm truly not going to take up this much time with all of this. So this panel is built on how we make good public policy, and this conversation is about how we make good public policy, right? So we need information. So I guess that's me, although it's all of you as well. We need research and evidence, which is Sasha and many of you. And we need lived experience, because the other piece that happens with lots of families, lots of challenged kids and families, is that policymakers have not experienced those challenges. Sometimes they have. In the case of foster care, actually at this point, I think in the Michigan legislature, there's more legislators than I've seen in my experience here that have had some experience with child welfare, have been foster parents, have been adoptive parents, have been foster children. So sometimes, but a lot of the time that the lived experience of those systems is not in their lived experience, in people's lived experience. And so making sure that we have a check and balance on what we're talking about for services in the lived experience of people who are receiving those services is also a huge point in good public policy making. So I think that as we had talked about there's lots of information actually about child welfare system. That there were a couple of pieces I think that were available to you. So just, sort of how many kids, what's happening with them, how are they being placed. It's pretty easy to find a lot of information about the child welfare system. And I would say especially related to the settlement. there's tons of reporting that takes place, tons of reporting to the federal government, tons of reporting to the Michigan legislature, tons of reporting to monitors of the settlement. There's lots of information available. So the question becomes, is it the right information? Do policymakers actually have access to all of that information in ways that they can handle and figure out? And I don't mean that in any way other than I don't need a stack of information either, you know. I mean, that in ways that they can actually make use of. And then, is it actually the right information? So there's, I think what I'm gonna move to actually, because they're giving me the time, because I don't wanna, and everybody else has tons of awesome things to say. So, I'm just going to go through these quickly. I think we have a lot of understanding about what stabilizes families and what keeps them out of the child welfare system, and we have for many decades. The issue has not been so much that we don't understand this. The issue has been that we fail to invest in what that is. And I do know that Sasha's going to talk a little bit more about that. I can talk at another time about adverse childhood experiences, and I think that there's great brain science that's coming to bear for policymakers again right now about how stress and trauma literally changes your brain. And so we actually need to do a better job of preventing that. And then also dealing with it differently in the systems that serve kids and families. So we don't need any of that. So we've talked a lot to young people, and we have a young person on this panel, and caregivers in the system about sort of what do kids in care need, right? But the bottom line is, it's not all that different from what any kid needs. And so it's really more about how are we thinking about how are we getting these kids that actually face some uphill battles, more uphill battles than most, the kinds of things that they need, and how are our policies supporting that. And then this whole transitional piece, I think is, as we have talked about, is hugely important. We have lots of expertise in the room about transitioning out. Kids leave care, and a lot of times they leave care without being adopted, without having permanent families. And even when they have, sometimes that family connection is not what it needs to be. And I was kind of laughing about this slide when I was looking at my notes right now about as they leave, what do they need? So they need those things, and they also need money. I mean, they need resource. They actually need some support to move on in. So I was kind of shocked that I didn't say that. We can talk lots more as we go about what's available to people. There are people literally sitting at this front table that can talk a lot about that and more about it than I can. So policy recommendations, very quickly. Invest in practices that address what destabilizes families, okay? You know, we know all sorts of things about what does that, and we need to figure out how to address those things, and then figure out, involve the people who are living these experiences in how this might work to assist. Obviously, we have to improve access to supports that stabilize work in school, because part of what happens is that people don't have resources to take care of their kids, and that what might be useful is if more of them got through high school and if more of them could get a decent job and whatever, right? So there's those supports too. And then the idea of actually supports for young people before they have families to make sure that they're getting on the right path. Foster care policy, obviously training and support for caregivers is a huge issue. Kids coming into care have more complicated issues than ever before. We're asking foster parents and kin and other people to do a lot. And we have foster parents in this room and other people that can actually speak to that. And they need to be trained, and they need to have support. Child care subsidy needs to be better, as I had said early on, timely, appropriate access to behavioral health services. I can't tell you the number of people that are caregivers in the system that are like, I could not get a mental health referral for this kid, and that's not because they're not supposed to, or that, you know, that's not what is intended to happen. It's that the systems around it, the systems around child welfare are not robust, and you can't find a provider. You can't figure it out. And then obviously education system, the quality, Children's Assurance of Quality Foster Care Act was one of the takeaways I wanted to say here. This is a bill that's basically to put into state law a lot of the programmatic responsibilities that exist right now about timeliness of service, about service access, what's your recourse when you're not getting service, how is this all going? This has been introduced in the last 4 legislative sessions. Legislative sessions are 2 years. So it's been introduced for a long time. Last year got through the House, didn't get through the Senate. This year through the House, not getting through the Senate. It's one of those things. We just need to get it through. The transition policy implications, again, we'll talk more about this as time goes on. Continuing services to kids as they age is hugely important. And really, and I don't know, I'm assuming this will get brought up in this conversation, but these things need to not, we need to take time and age out of the equation of some of these things. Does it really matter if the kid is 23? Or are we actually interested in the kid having some kind of credential? Or being able to have stable housing? Or, to think about things as a little bit differently than age is probably useful in the longer term as well. High school diploma success, one of the significant things about kids in care is that while they don't graduate from traditional high schools very much, lots of them get their GED. So we need to think through how, and that's because they move around and they can't accumulate credits, and so we have to think about how are we actually taking advantage of systems that are serving them, moving them into post-secondary, and all the rest of these things too. So we must. That's what this conversation is about. We have huge responsibility, and Sasha's going to take you through.